The forest did not become silent when the fighting stopped. It became silent long before that. Not the kind of silence that followed explosions, when the air rang and the ground still trembled. This silence existed earlier, deeper and heavier. It was the silence that settled when men stopped moving because movement itself had become dangerous. January 1943, western edge of the Rzhev salient. The snow-covered forest stretched for kilometers in every direction, broken only by thin lines of frozen streams and narrow paths cut by boots, sleds, and tracked vehicles months earlier. Overnight, fresh snow had erased most of those traces. What remained were shadows and guesses. Private Ivan Morozov lay pressed into the snow near the edge of the trees, his body already numb from the cold. He had been in the same position since before dawn, long enough for the frost to harden on his greatcoat and for the stiffness in his joints to become something distant, something he could no longer clearly feel. He was 22 years old. He had been at the front for less than 4 months. He was not a sniper. He was not a scout. He was not trained for independent action. He was infantry. Hours earlier, his platoon had been ordered forward under cover of darkness. The instructions were simple in theory and vague in execution. Advance through the forest, locate enemy positions, report contact. The map they carried was already outdated. Trenches marked on paper no longer existed. Villages had burned and collapsed. The terrain had changed under snow, shell fire, and time. They moved in a loose line, each man responsible for watching the back of the soldier ahead of him. No one spoke. No one coughed. Even the sound of equipment had been muted. Canteens wrapped in cloth, metal buckles secured. At some point during the advance, Morozov lost sight of the man in front of him. At first, he assumed the line had slowed. This happened often in forests. Men adjusted their pace to avoid branches, roots, uneven ground. Morozov stopped and waited. Seconds passed. Then a minute. The man did not reappear. Morozov took a cautious step forward, then another, careful to place his boots where the snow was already disturbed. He strained to hear movement ahead. That was when he heard it. Breathing. Not his own. Slow. Measured. Close. Close enough that he could hear air passing through teeth. Morozov froze. He did not turn his head. He did not lift his rifle. He did not move at all. Every instinct urged him to react, but training, what little training he had, overrode instinct. In winter forests, sound carried farther than sight. Snow muffled footsteps, but amplified the smallest disturbances. A shift in fabric, a brush against bark, the scrape of metal. Morozov pressed his face deeper into the snow, ignoring the sharp burn against his skin. His breath slowed, controlled as best he could. He focused on not exhaling too forcefully, on keeping the cloud of vapor in front of his mouth as small as possible. The breathing continued. It was coming from somewhere ahead of him, slightly to the left, low to the ground. Not hurried, not panicked. Whoever it was knew exactly where they were. Minutes passed. Morozov's thoughts began to race, then settle, then race again. If the man ahead was German, then Morozov was already within killing distance. The enemy had either not seen him yet, or had seen him and was waiting. If the man was Soviet, then Morozov had somehow become separated from his unit, and was now lying meters away from a comrade who might fire at the first sign of movement. Either way, Morozov was trapped by uncertainty. The forest offered no clarity. The trees were bare. their branches skeletal against the gray sky. Snow flattened depth and distance, erasing the sharp edges that helped the eye distinguish shape from shadow. Everything blended together: trunks, ground, fallen branches. Morozov could not see 10 meters clearly. He could only hear. The breathing stopped. Morozov felt his stomach tighten. He counted silently. 1, 2, 3. Nothing. Then the breathing returned, closer. A shift in weight, a soft compression of snow. The man ahead was crawling. Morozov's fingers tightened around the stock of his rifle. The Mosin Nagant felt unnaturally cold, the metal biting through his gloves. He had fired the rifle on the range. He had fired it during brief engagements at distance. He had never fired it at a man he could not see. Morozov adjusted his position by a fraction, just enough to bring the rifle forward without lifting his body from the snow. He aligned the barrel toward the sound, not aiming so much as pointing, trying to anticipate where a shape might emerge. The sound stopped again. This time, the silence lasted longer. Morozov began to wonder if the breathing had ever been real. Cold and exhaustion played tricks on the mind. Men hallucinated in winter. They heard voices. They imagined movement where there was none. But this felt deliberate. This felt controlled. He remembered something an older soldier had told him weeks earlier, during a brief rest behind the lines. In winter forests, the man who moves first usually dies. Morozov waited. A branch creaked somewhere to his right. Not loud, not sharp, just enough. Morozov knew then that he was not alone. Whoever was out there was testing him, listening for a reaction, measuring distance. Morozov forced himself to stay still. The cold deepened as the morning wore on. His legs began to ache, then lose sensation entirely. The snow beneath his chest melted slightly from his body heat, soaking through layers of fabric until the cold felt wet and invasive. Still, he did not move. If you want to understand how survival on the Eastern Front often depended not on strength or weapons, but on patience and fear, this channel focuses on moments like this, where nothing happens and everything is decided. The light began to change. Gray shifted toward pale white as the overcast sky brightened. Snow reflected the light, making the forest appear more exposed, more open. Shadows thinned. Shapes gained definition. Morozov's position was becoming worse by the minute. Soon, something would give him away. A boot, a sleeve, a breath. He began to consider his options. Staying still meant trusting that whoever was ahead would move on or reveal themselves first. Moving meant confirming his presence and risking immediate fire. The breathing returned. This time, it was directly in front of him, less than 10 meters away. Morozov closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of his platoon, of the man he had been following, of how easily lines broke in forests like this. Then he opened his eyes and began to raise the rifle. The moment before the shot would decide everything. Morozov did not fire, not immediately. The rifle rose slowly, centimeter by centimeter, careful not to disturb the snow beneath his elbows. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, as if his body were acting independently of his thoughts. The breathing remained steady. Close. Too close. Morozov aligned the barrel with the sound, not with any visible target. There was nothing to see, only a vague darkness where the forest seemed thicker, where branches overlapped and shadows deepened. He waited for a shape, for a mistake, for confirmation. None came. The breathing stopped again. Morozov froze, the rifle suspended just above the snow. Seconds stretched. His arms began to tremble, not from fear alone, but from the strain of holding position. The cold had seeped deep into his muscles, slowing them, dulling sensation. Then, softly, unmistakably, snow compressed again, closer than before. Morozov realized then that whoever was ahead of him was not advancing blindly. The movement was cautious, controlled, calculated. The man crawling through the snow understood the terrain, understood sound, understood the value of patience. This was not panic. This was hunting. Morozov's mind began to work through possibilities. If he fired now, he would reveal his position instantly. Even if he hit the unseen man, the sound would carry through the forest. Others, if there were others, would know exactly where to aim. If he waited, he risked allowing the man ahead to close the distance further. At 10 meters, reaction time mattered less than instinct. At 5 meters, there would be no time at all. Morozov adjusted the rifle again, bringing the butt tighter into his shoulder. He inhaled slowly, then exhaled just as slowly, forcing his breath to remain steady. The forest remained still. Then something changed. A shadow shifted, not a clear outline, not a full shape, just a subtle difference in texture against the snow. Morozov focused his gaze, narrowing his vision. The shape was low to the ground, elongated, moving in short, controlled increments. A body. German field gray blended well with winter terrain. The enemy had learned this early in the war. Cloaks, overcoats, even blankets were repurposed to break up outlines. Morozov could not see a face. He could not see a weapon, but he could see movement. The man was angled slightly away from him now, crawling diagonally, perhaps attempting to circle, to flank, to observe before committing. Morozov's finger rested on the trigger. He hesitated. Training told him to wait for certainty. But certainty rarely existed at this distance, in this terrain. The longer he waited, the more control the enemy gained. The shadow stopped moving. Morozov felt his heart hammer in his chest. Had he been seen? The forest held its breath. Then the shadow moved again, this time turning slightly, exposing a clearer outline against the snow. A shoulder, the curve of a helmet, the dark shape of a rifle held close to the body. That was enough. Morozov fired. The sound shattered the silence, sharp and violent, echoing between the trees. The recoil drove the rifle back into his shoulder, jarring his numb limbs awake with pain. The shadow jerked, then collapsed. Morozov worked the bolt automatically, the spent cartridge ejecting into the snow. He did not pause to confirm the kill. He rolled to his right and crawled, moving fast now, abandoning the careful stillness that had protected him moments earlier. Snow filled his sleeves, his collar, his mouth. He had seconds, perhaps less. A shot cracked from somewhere ahead and to the left. The round snapped past him, tearing through branches where he had been lying. Morozov kept moving. Another shot, then another. Bullets punched into the snow behind him, throwing up sprays of white and dirt. The enemy was not alone. Morozov reached the base of a fallen tree and pressed himself against it, chest heaving, lungs burning with cold air. He forced himself to slow his breathing, to listen. Shouts erupted in the distance. German voices, short commands, urgent, angry. The forest was no longer silent. Morozov understood now what he had walked into. This was not a lone enemy scout. This was a forward security element. A screen. The Germans had expected contact. Morozov checked his rifle. The bolt was forward, chamber loaded. He had 4 rounds left in the magazine. 4. He glanced around, trying to orient himself. The forest looked different now that movement had begun. Paths appeared where none had existed before. Shadows shifted with each step, each turn of the head. He could no longer tell where his platoon was. If they were still advancing, they would soon run into the same screen-alerted, ready, waiting. Morozov had to decide quickly. Retreating blindly risked running into enemy fire or getting lost entirely. Advancing risked drawing more attention and cutting himself off completely. The Germans began to move. Morozov could hear them now. Boots compressing snow, equipment shifting, men spreading out. They were searching. Slowly. Methodically. Morozov pressed his face against the bark of the fallen tree, using it to break up his outline. He watched through gaps in the branches, tracking movement. A figure appeared briefly between 2 trees, then disappeared. Another followed. They were not rushing. They were confident. Morozov felt the weight of isolation settle over him. This was not the chaos of a large engagement where noise and smoke blurred responsibility. This was precise, personal. If he survived this, it would be because of decisions made in seconds, alone. A shape moved closer, 20 meters now. Morozov shifted the rifle, aligning it with the approaching figure. He waited until the man stepped into a patch of lighter snow, where contrast made the outline clearer. He fired. The German soldier fell forward, disappearing into the snow. Morozov rolled again, moving immediately, expecting return fire. Shots rang out, closer this time. Bark exploded from the tree he had just left. Morozov crawled, then ran, weaving between trunks, keeping low. His lungs burned, his legs screamed, but he did not stop. He reached a shallow depression, a shell crater long since filled with snow and debris, and dropped into it. He lay still, chest pressed against frozen earth, rifle held tight. Above him, boots passed, voices murmured. A rifle butt struck a tree nearby. The Germans were close enough now that Morozov could hear their breathing. Not imagined, not uncertain. Real. He forced himself to remain motionless. Minutes passed. The search widened. The voices drifted farther away. Morozov waited long after the last sound faded. Only when the forest returned to a fragile quiet did he move again. He rose slowly, scanning every direction. The body of the first German lay half buried in snow where it had fallen. Morozov did not look at it for long. He moved away, angling east, trying to reach what he hoped was Soviet territory. He moved cautiously now, listening more than looking, stopping often. The forest had changed. It was no longer neutral ground. It was hostile. As daylight continued to strengthen, Morozov understood the danger he was in. If he did not reconnect with his unit soon, he would be forced to navigate through contested territory alone. Worse, the Germans now knew Soviet troops were operating in the area. He came upon tracks multiple sets, overlapping, confused. Soviet boots, German boots, retreats and advances layered over each other. The line between sides had dissolved. Morozov followed the tracks carefully, choosing those that angled east and north. He moved for nearly an hour, covering ground slowly, deliberately. Then he heard it again. Breathing. This time it was behind him. Morozov froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone was following him. Carefully. Patiently. He had been hunted. Morozov lowered himself to the snow, heart pounding, rifle angled back the way he had come. He waited. The breathing grew closer. This was not the same man as before. This was someone who had learned, someone who knew Morozov would move. Morozov tightened his grip on the rifle. The forest closed in around him. The next decision would not be delayed. Morozov did not turn around. Not immediately. He remained pressed into the snow, rifle angled back along the path he had taken, every muscle locked in place. The sound behind him was unmistakable now. This was not imagined. This was not the echo of memory or fear. Someone was there. The breathing was controlled, shallow, close enough that Morozov could hear it change with movement. Whoever followed him understood what they were doing. They were not rushing. They were not searching blindly. They were tracking. Morozov slowed his own breathing until each inhale felt like an effort of will. The cold no longer burned. It had moved past pain into numbness, into something distant and dull. His fingers felt thick around the rifle stock, clumsy, but he did not loosen his grip. The forest seemed to narrow. Trees that had once felt evenly spaced now appeared closer together, crowding his vision, limiting his options. Snow reflected the pale daylight, making shadows softer but more deceptive. Everything looked the same, except the sound, a faint compression of snow. Closer. Morozov realized that if he waited any longer, the distance would close beyond recovery. Reaction time would vanish. Instinct would take over. He needed control. Slowly, carefully, Morozov shifted his weight forward, as if preparing to crawl. He allowed the movement to be visible, not sudden, not exaggerated, just enough. The breathing behind him paused. That was confirmation. Morozov rolled. He did not aim. He fired. The shot cracked through the forest, sharp and final. The recoil drove into his shoulder as the rifle bucked. He worked the bolt in one practiced motion, ejecting the cartridge without looking. The sound behind him stopped. Morozov fired again, this time aiming lower, where the body would fall. Snow erupted. Then nothing. He did not wait to see the result. Morozov rolled away and crawled, moving fast, erratic, abandoning the careful patterns that had protected him earlier. If there were others, they would already be moving toward the sound. He reached a shallow ditch where the ground dipped slightly, providing minimal cover, and dropped into it. He lay still, listening. No return fire. No shouts. The forest did not react the way it had before. Morozov waited. Seconds passed, then minutes. Still nothing. Cautiously, Morozov raised his head and looked back along the path he had come. A body lay half-turned in the snow, motionless. A rifle rested beside it, dark against the white ground. German. Morozov felt no relief, only a deeper awareness of what this meant. He was still alone. He checked his ammunition. 2 rounds left. 2. He had no way of knowing how many Germans were still nearby, or how far the nearest Soviet unit might be. The earlier engagement had drawn attention. If German patrols were operating in the area, they would be converging. Morozov needed to move again. He rose slowly, keeping low, and began moving east, choosing his path carefully. He avoided open ground, stayed close to tree lines, paused often to listen. The forest no longer felt neutral. Every sound mattered now. A branch falling under snow weight, wind moving through bare limbs, his own boots compressing the surface. Each noise carried meaning. Morozov moved for nearly an hour, covering ground slowly, deliberately, forcing himself not to rush despite the growing fatigue. His body protested. His legs felt heavy. His shoulders ached from tension. The cold was constant. He came upon another body. This one, Soviet. The man lay on his side near a tree, partially covered by snow, his helmet missing. The rifle was still slung across his back. Morozov recognized him, not by name, but by face. They had shared bread the night before the advance. Morozov knelt briefly, scanning the area before approaching. He did not touch the body. There was nothing he could do. The realization settled heavily. The line had not merely broken. It had dissolved. Morozov stood and continued on. The forest began to thin as the terrain sloped gently upward. The trees grew farther apart, the ground uneven beneath the snow. Visibility improved slightly, but exposure increased with it. Morozov moved cautiously, stopping often to listen. That was when he heard something different. Voices. Not German. Soviet. Distant, but unmistakable. Morozov froze, listening intently. The voices were low, disciplined. There was movement, multiple men. He resisted the urge to call out. Friendly fire had killed men just as surely as the enemy. Instead, Morozov shifted his position to make himself visible without appearing threatening. He raised one hand slowly, rifle held low in the other. He waited. The voices grew closer. Figures emerged between the trees. 3 men, then 5. Soviet infantry, weapons ready but not raised. Morozov remained still. A shout. An order. The rifles lowered. Morozov felt his knees weaken as the tension drained from his body, replaced by exhaustion so deep it bordered on collapse. He was led back through the trees, guided rather than escorted, as if the others sensed how close he was to giving in to fatigue. Only after they reached a shallow defensive position did Morozov allow himself to sit. He did not speak. He did not need to. The men around him understood without explanation. Later, as dusk approached, Morozov learned what had happened. The platoon he had been part of had walked into a prepared German screen. Contact had been made almost immediately. Fighting had broken out along the forest edge, chaotic and confused. Men had been lost, positions abandoned. The advance halted. Morozov's absence had gone unnoticed at first, then assumed fatal. No one asked him how he survived. They did not need to. That night, Morozov sat apart from the others, rifle across his knees, staring into the dark forest beyond the perimeter. Fires were forbidden. The cold pressed in from all sides. Sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was shallow and restless. The days that followed blurred together. The front shifted. Orders changed. Positions were taken and abandoned. Morozov remained with his unit. He fought. He moved. He survived. But something had changed. He no longer rushed. He listened more. He moved when necessary, and stayed still when staying still mattered more. Months later, the forest would be far behind him. So would Rzhev, but the memory would not fade. Years later, after the war had ended and uniforms had been put away, Morozov would still remember the sound. Breathing. Not his own. He would remember how close it had been, how easily it could have ended differently. He would remember the waiting more than the shooting. because that was where the decision had been made, not in the moment of fire, but in the silence before it. Morozov survived the war. He returned home with no medals worth mentioning, no stories he cared to tell. When asked about the front, he spoke little. Some things did not need words. They followed a man home quietly, and they stayed, long after the forest was gone.